Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian. And it's great to be back on here with my great friend, El Jefe, Pete Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. How are you, my friend? I love the shirt.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Kevin also complimented me on it as well. It took a lot of time to pick out this particular shirt for this evening. So
I'm honored.
Let me just set the record. Jefe thing is not of my doing. I'm easygoing, and John can call me whatever he wants to call me. But that's a choice.
It's all out of love, my friend.
Absolutely. So this evening, we have Kevin Levin with us. Kevin is also a very old friend. Again, we have been in the same circles for, 20 years maybe? At least?
Yeah.
When Kevin was in Charlottesville, and he was teaching at a private school there. And it's also in Charlottesville where he started his very popular blog, Civil War Memory. And let me just say a few things about the blog, Civil War Memory. In so many ways, it was cutting edge because it brought public historians in contact with our public so that we could actually have a conversation with them and a sustained conversation at that. And Kevin was right out there. It's certainly one of the first. And I think one of the things that I've always admired and appreciated about Kevin is he's utterly fearless. And that is almost always a good thing for our field. Kevin is always, I think, quick to push back on very comfortable and accepted understandings of the war. He often does it in a way, again, that I think is respectful, but also creates real conversation. And Kevin, as you know, John and I have talked at length about this convergence between public historians and academic historians. And certainly one of the best examples is the work that you have done. And it's just not on Civil War memory. Kevin has widely published in scholarly venues as well as in magazines. He talks to audiences of all kinds, and he is especially committed to working with teachers, which is, in a sense, I think Kevin would say, his true calling. He's taught at a number of institutions. Your most recent institution, if I get it correctly, was it GAN? Because I think they came to Gettysburg and we had some time on the battlefield.
You did? A couple of years ago. Yep.
It was a couple of years ago as well. So again, I would say that, Kevin, unlike many of us, he makes a contribution in all of these areas. And I know that some people find him to be very controversial. And some people I know get agitated at the opinions that he puts forth. But you have to respect Kevin because he respects other opinions. He, though, shows that respect in challenging people whose ideas or whose arguments I probably in need of being challenged. And so the tables might turn a little bit this evening on you, Kevin, because we're going to actually have some questions as well. And we'll have questions first about Kevin's book, Searching for Black Confederates, published by UNC Press, of course. And we have, there it is.
There you go.
Put up the code for UNC. And all you have to do is get on the UNC webpage and you can order this book. So we're going to spend probably 20 to 30 minutes talking about this very important book. And then we'll devote the rest of our time talking about Confederate monuments and what's happening in Richmond within the context of these recent protests. So Kevin, I will go ahead and get us started. And let's just ask the big, and what I would say is the question that helps us understand what happened in Confederate armies when it came to using enslaved people, because of course enslaved people in the Confederate armies, they had a wide range of tasks, right, that were demanded of them. So I think the first important question is, who were these slaves? What did they do in Confederate armies?
Yeah. Well, first, let me thank the two of you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the book and just to spent some time with both of you. I've been watching the series, really enjoyed it, and of course, John, you deserve all of our thanks for finally doing the impossible, which is getting Pete to embrace social media. I thought I would never see the day, but he's really taken to this, and he's done a great job. I mean, he's sort of a combination of a little bit of the bite of Howard Stern and sort of the empathy of, remember Phil Donahue, right? I mean, he brings sort of both of these things together.
Remember Phil would run around the audience all the time and trip over chairs. And,
exactly. So this is great. I really do appreciate it. Look, I think if we were all just to sort of do a little mental exercise and sort of close our eyes and imagine, what a Confederate army looked like, say in the summer of 1863, marching north through Maryland and into South Central Pennsylvania, I think that most of us would, like I did before I really got into the researching of this book, I think we imagine an army of white men, right? Lee's army numbered somewhere, correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere around 75,000 men in the summer of 1863. And I think that sort of captures our sort of popular perception or image of what a Confederate army looked like. But as I researched into the wartime sources themselves and tried to sort of begin to imagine the place of enslaved men within the rank and file, I ended up with a very different picture. If we imagine that Lee's army by some estimates numbered at least 10,000 enslaved men, I think that gives us a very different picture of Lee's army. And I think it forces us to step back and reevaluate, rethink how we understand the place of slavery within the army itself. Because I think we tend to think of, I think we're now at the point, it's safe to say, when we think about the Confederacy, I think most of us, tonight have no problem acknowledging the centrality of slavery to the Confederacy as a whole. But I think oftentimes it remains something abstract. So, Alexander Stephens's cornerstone address, we get it, we accept it, we understand it, but it doesn't really sort of filter into the army itself. And I think I think when you read the book, I think you have to sort of come to terms with the fact that the army was a real reflection of a slaveholding society and a nation committed to protecting and extending the institution of slavery. And we see that in the ranks itself. Obviously, the Confederacy throughout the war impressed tens of thousands of enslaved men to do any number of tasks throughout the nation, constructing earthworks, repairing rail lines, working at places like Tredegar Iron Works. But we also see them in the army itself. The obvious examples are the men that I write about, the body servants, or what I call camp slaves within the army. But of course, you would have had teamsters, you would have had blacksmiths, you would have had people sort of working as attendants in hospitals. You would have had enslaved men, playing a role in maintaining supply lines. So they were everywhere, right? And I don't think it was possible. I think what we need to sort of acknowledge is that however effectively these armies functioned in camp, on the march, and even on the battlefield, I think we have to acknowledge the central role that enslaved labor played in allowing them to do all of that. They were not ancillary, they were central, I think, to that. And I think that the men in the ranks would have understood that. And so I think that is sort of one of the big takeaways for me in the course of doing this research.
A quick follow-up, and then I'll turn it over to John.
Yeah.
Kevin, you're at in front of a bunch of National Park Service historians.
Yeah.
And you have to make a case. How do we bring the experience of enslaved men in Confederate armies? How do we bring that on the battlefield? Because as you well know, for so long, historians, and again, I do understand this, you said when we're on the battlefield, the people who go on our tours, they want site-specific stories. They want to hear about what they can see. So with your research and with what have been and what is a continuing challenge in battlefield interpretation, what would you say?
Well, it would have been this question would have been much easier to answer if we had actually gone through and done our tour that we had planned to do.
We were. We'll do that. We'll have to do that
at some point. But I think it's not easy. But I think there are a number of sort of windows into a battle like Gettysburg. I mean, certainly we can talk about the relationship between the Confederate officer and the camp slave. We can sort of talk about, for example, so the case of Colonel Henry Burgwin of the 26th North Carolina. We can talk about, his camp slave. I think you pronounce it Kinsian, who took control. He buried after Burgwin's death. Took responsibility for, I think, burying the body, transporting his personal effects home to his family. So I think we can talk about, through that relationship, however difficult it might be, to talk about sort of the ways in which, enslaved or camp slaves function to allow a Confederate officer to do his job, to actually carry out his responsibilities. Porter Alexander, of course, talks quite a bit about sort of the extent to which he relied on his own camp slave. This was actually someone he hired. He didn't own him, but he functioned as a camp slave. And we can talk about sort of the ways in which Porter Alexander relied on this individual to transport notices back and forth between camps with Lee and other officers. I think there are a number of places. I mean, I think one of the more powerful spots might be Cemetery Ridge. And Pete, I think it was you. I'm actually positive it was you. You sort of pointed this out, that we imagine sort of the tide turning on July 3rd, 1863, with Confederates sort of trying to make their way, limping back toward Spangler's Woods. Yeah. And I think you pointed out that at that point, we would likely have seen a good number of camp slaves flooding out to meet, right. Their masters, to assist them in various ways. So I think those are a couple ways, I guess, we could begin to find a place for the camp slave in the battlefield interpretation. And then I'll give you one more quick example. I think there's also sort of a memory side to this as well. I mean, one of my favorite spots is the North Carolina Monument. It's a powerful monument. I think it dates to 1930, 1929, around that point. It doesn't really matter. There's a wonderful sort of lost cause inspired inscription that goes with it. And of course, those men are facing the Bryan farm, right? Which we know, of course, was owned by a free black family. And I think, when I led tours and watched other tours, in the past, I've tended to focus on the soldier experience. What did that ridge off in the distance mean to these men? What would that experience have been like? What was hanging in the balance on July 3rd? But I wonder if we can also sort of find ways to ask that question for what certainly would have been a good number of enslaved men in the ranks at that very spot. And how can that complicate the narrative of Gettysburg, and more specifically, something as mythologized as Pickett's charge itself? How does that sort of complicate the Gettysburg narrative? And I think that to me is a sort of a wonderful entry point in getting at the memory of not just the Confederate Army, the rank and file, but also how we think about the memory of slavery and the Confederate Army's relationship to slavery.
And I should Chris Gwynn was the fifth there, but even prior to Chris Gwynn's arrival as Chief of Interpretation at Gettysburg National Park, they have gone to great lengths to not only interpret the Bryan farm, where a African American lived during the battle, but they've also just recently one of the War Department towers, the one on Seminary Ridge that overlooks Dwight D. Eisenhower's farm, and from there you can see the Maryland state line. And so when you go up the tower now, there is a map that, of course, positions you in that area and points out that just a few miles away was the dividing line between slavery and free labor. So, again, all of this that you point to in your ideas, I think that you have now put public historians who are already doing some of that work, but I think at other sites now that they can certainly populate those historical landscapes with the full cast of characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kevin, as you know, and smart people know, I'm from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and our memory of Lee's men coming through Chambersburg is quite different than a lot of other people would imagine, because obviously our town was burned in 1864, but in 1863 when Lee comes north, there's basically what one historian called a large kidnapping expedition. When I was reading in your book about free African Americans being taken by these troops, it really, kind of showed to me that, and I knew the story, but it's just reading it in your accounts where it shows to me and to other readers how much this isn't a nice clean cut way of war. No army is clean cut, and this is no exception. With your research involved with that, what was something that really stuck out to you, or how did you come about that research to find these instances of the kidnappings?
Well, luckily that aspect of the Gettysburg Campaign, had already been, I think, well researched. I mean, a number of really good studies, have been published on that particular aspect. What I tried to do was just sort of fill it out a little bit. So there were a number of really interesting accounts that I came across. I mean, I think one of the best known is Arthur Fremantle, right, who is easily accessible. And he talks about, as the Army is sort of crossing that state line between Maryland and Pennsylvania, he sort of observes at least I think he says there are at least 20 servants following each regiment, right? So he points out, again, what by that point in time, had sort of solidified in my head in terms of the presence, the numbers present, in the Army. And you have to sort of wonder, what were these men aware of that operation? To what extent did, if at all, were they involved in carrying it out? Again, it's just another sort of entry point that sort of complicates how we think about the campaign as a whole, and the actors that we at least try to wrap our heads around. In this case, it's very difficult for the obvious reasons in terms of the accounts that we have available. But it just does lead to additional questions about how those men, those enslaved men, marching together in many cases, experienced that aspect of the war. What did entering a free state mean to enslaved men? I mean, essentially, Lee's army is he didn't just invade Pennsylvania. He was extending the institution of slavery, I think we can say. And I think that's just another way of complicating how we think about the campaign as a whole. Also, on the flip side, on the retreat back across the Potomac, you see the Army fall apart in many respects, and many of these men end up escaping these camp slaves. Many of the number of accounts I found, they stick around and they do what they can with their masters for whatever reason, assisting them. But you also see this relationship, this master-slave dynamic, stretched to the breaking point. And that was also one of the things I was curious about in these first two chapters on the war. We typically think of the master-slave relationship in the context of the plantation. And I was curious, to what extent does the contingency of camp life, long marches, the battles itself, to what extent does this relationship stretch and contract over time? Because there's a negotiation going on here, I think, between both parties. And during the retreat from Gettysburg, you see it stretched to the breaking point in many cases.
Well, Kevin, I think that what your work does, it reaffirms that the master-slave relationship was always fluid, always changing, always dependent upon where it's located, and of course the idiosyncratic characteristics of the particular master or the slave itself, right? And so I think that, again, your work also shows that it was highly adaptable, right? That the notion that, of course, it could only be used for agricultural purposes. I mean, that's been blown out of the water now. Right. But I think that your work reaffirms that. But I think what your work, though, does, it points in an area that I'd like maybe for you to sort of flesh out a little bit more for us tonight. And that is, there is a performative aspect of the master-slave relationship, of course. And within the army itself, we know that the slaves and the enslaved people are, surrounded by thousands of white men with guns. I've never seen anything like that at all. And of course, you can attest to get the voice of that enslaved person, you can only get it through the documents of Confederates, of white men, which of course raises a host of all kinds of interpretive challenges that I hope that you'll share with us. So I'm now going to give you a quick example. I'm not going to read it. It's from the letters of Clement Evans, the book's called Intrepid Warrior. The letters include letters actually from his wife. It's rare to get two-way correspondence. The enslaved man that followed, forced to follow Evans around, I think his name was Sam. I cannot remember his first name, but I'm going to summarize what Evans wrote to his wife about Sam's behavior during the Gettysburg Campaign. All right. And I know this is maybe slightly unfair and going to be hard for you to truly sort of dig deep into this summary that I'm about to offer, but we'll give it a whirl. So Evans wrote to his wife, and he, of course, boasted that Sam did not run away. In fact, he said that he offered Sam the opportunity to go, have your freedom, leave the army, and Sam would hear nothing of it. Not only did he not leave, but when Evans is a Georgian, when the Georgians were in the town of Gettysburg on the evening of July 1st, for whatever reason, Sam was wearing a uniform, and I believe he was wearing a blue coat. And I don't know what prompted Clement Evans or Sam to do this, but they took Sam and they let Sam knock on the doors of a bunch of civilians in town, and they got a big chuckle to see, one, how frightened the civilians were, but two, sort of mystified, why is there a black man wearing the Union blue? And so he writes about that. And then finally, here's the last part for you to analyze. Evans made it very clear to his family that Sam was very dependent upon him, and dependent upon him not just for material comforts, but dependent upon him to sort of be brave and to hold up. That Sam told him time and time again that when the bomb started bursting, that he needed to go to the rear. And so again, Evans was sort of affirming here, look, I am the protector of this man. He, in fact, is very obligated to me, not out of necessity, but because there is a real bond here. All right. That, again, I want to stress and emphasize. Those are not my words. Those are the words of, now, Clement Evans. And I'll quickly say this. For any analysis, to begin with racism and to end with racism is no analysis at all. Clement Evans obviously upheld the racial views of his class, not of all whites, but of his class. All right, Kevin, go at it.
Yeah, I think Evans, and I've read other accounts, like this, and I think you can take this any number of ways. I think first and foremost, it speaks to the need on the part of Evans in the context of the Army, a situation that is constantly evolving, where there are any number of dangers that he's going to have to face, along with his body servant, his camp slave, that can sort of impact both of them at any point in time. I think what I hear is Evans really needing to believe that Sam is going to remain loyal to him through thick and thin. And again, like I said, there are any number of accounts that I've read where you sort of, you read the same sentiment. I I can give you another example if it might help.
You can't. Let's keep going just a little bit more. And John can do it as well. Well, why is it so hard, so difficult, so impossible for Evans to actually stand outside of himself and take the view of Sam? So let's talk about the idea. He goes to Sam and says, Sam, you're in the land of milk and honey for black folks, supposedly. At least that's what the abolitionists are saying. Go enjoy it. It's all yours. Sam says no. Now, that's fodder for the lost cause. That's
right.
Fodder to say, hey, man, this was a relationship that could not be broken out of affection. What would you say?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's why we need to know, we need to know something about Sam. I think another example where
Wait, I'm going to ask, we don't need to know anything about Sam, in fact.
Why?
Well, because, good God Almighty, hell, it's Pennsylvania. He's from the South. Where in the hell is he going to go? He doesn't have any money. I mean, this is the idea that we have, that there is freedom and they didn't seize it, or African Americans didn't seize it. Well, they didn't seize it because that unknown, what could that actually be in reality in terms of freedom? There's the devil you know, that's Evans. There's the devil you don't know, and that's a bunch of white Pennsylvanians. And how are you going to survive? How are you going to exist? So
I guess I would want to know, does Sam have family back home?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I mean, we know in the case of the famous photograph of Andrew and Silas Chandler, Silas Chandler has any number of opportunities to run off. In fact, after his master is wounded at Chickamauga, he supposedly takes him to a hospital and escorts him back home. And of course, that's fodder for the lost cause folks as well. But Silas has a wife and a newborn child back home that he's never seen before. So I do think I do think we need to know something about Sam. It just sounds to me like Evans. Look, Evans, I think, may have seen in Sam signs of defiance. It may have been very subtle. He may have, disobeyed an order at some point. So it seems to me that Evans has every reason to want to exaggerate, the loyalty of his camp slave. There's another wonderful example out of South Carolina, a captain by the name of Winsmith, who brings a camp slave with him by the name of Spencer at the very beginning of the war. They're on James Island in the summer of 1862. Winsmith goes back to Spartanburg to recruit additional men for his company. While he's home, he learns that Spencer has basically run off. Right. And now this is someone, you read his letters, beautiful letters from the beginning of the war. He is absolutely convinced that Spencer is going to be the best camp slave in the entire army. He has absolutely no doubt that he's going to remain loyal through thick and thin, no doubt whatsoever. And he's not worried when he first gets that initial letter reporting Spencer's disappearance. He gets back to camp. Spencer still hasn't appeared. He's still not worried. He's run off with someone. He'll be back. And even when he starts getting worried, he starts blaming others. He says, well, the Union Navy offshore kidnapped him, or there was a free black guy from Charleston who came in and he was a bad influence. Winsmith can never sort of embrace the possibility that Spencer would run off and seize his freedom, which is likely what he did, right? And so again, and what's also interesting is after he comes to terms with this, he basically sends word to his family, send along another camp slave, right? I need someone else to help me. So there's the instrumental value in the end that really sort of serves as, the foundation for all of this, right? These slaves are useful. They're needed in camp. So, again, it sounds like, I think these men really do need to believe that they are going to remain loyal. And this creates a lot of tension because I think, they are sharing these masters and slaves. They live through, very difficult moments during the war. They deal with the winters, the weather. They deal with disease. Those are, I think, some of the most interesting cases because you really do have to conclude that they are sharing an experience. It forces them to, in many cases, to take care of one another. There is some kind of bond that forms in some cases, although, of course, I do not want to call it friendship. But there are other regarding kinds of attachments going on here.
Or maybe, it's not a bond of comradeship, based on a sense of equality that
No.
white man would have shared with another white man, but there is a physical intimacy and an emotional intimacy that's absolutely undeniable. And if if we're unwilling to try to explore that because we are nervous or uneasy, that's fodder for the lost cause. You and I, of course, I think would agree with that. Those lost cause addicts of sorts, it doesn't matter what we say, right? I mean, they're not interested in serious historical inquiry. They're not interested, I think, in pursuing these kinds of very difficult questions that require, I think, a fair amount of nuance. I'll just end with this. And Kevin, again, what your book reminds me of is there is the functionality of the camp slave. And the letters attest to the fact that they are, the owners, most interested in what that slave can do for me in a very practical way. If you get yourself home, right, and get me provisions, get me a uniform, and get back here, or wash my dishes, or cook my food. And the references to them in their letters are actually often not very detailed, underscoring the fact that they continue to say, we are, of course, comrades in arms. The photograph, which I assume you'll show in just a moment, would also suggest that. But let's not forget, what they value them for above all else. And that is the thing to be used. And then I would say the second point here, and the great irony, is how much the owner, the master, that his sense of self-worth, his sense of being a man, Clement Evans, right? And this is in a very unconscious way. Hell, he's brought up in this world to believe that in mastery.
Why don't I show you an image?
Right, and he needs his slave to be what? He needs his slave to be more than just discipline.
Yep.
He needs his slave to show devotion and love. They're
right.
utterly dependent upon it.
Absolutely. I mean, John, should we bring up the,
yeah.
I think, so what do I do here? Just
share your photo there. If you've already done so, let me know.
So what do I do? Just stop screen, share screen?
Yeah, share screen there.
I'm not sure. Let's see here.
When you get guys like us off Twitter, we lose it. We don't know what we're doing.
You don't see it, do you?
There we go.
There you go.
Oh, you see it? Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, and so this might actually help us sort of think through some of these issues. Because I think, Pete, your last point, regarding sort of how these slave owners think of themselves, right? I think comes out in an image like this, right? I mean, there is, the camp slave standing by obediently, wearing the uniform, right? And so there's a lot of meaning that obviously, Comer is going to attach to the uniform, the way Burrell is posing. But of course, we also need to acknowledge how Burrell might have thought about wearing the uniform and posing next to this young officer.
Jim Broomall had a show today, Shepherd University, talking about photographs as well. John, is there anything in that photograph in terms of, I'd like to photograph.
Please.
Is there anything about the pose? Is there anything about the uniforms, about the clothing? Is there anything that speaks? There's like two big things that sort of cry out, at least from what I can see right now.
Well, with Burrell, I mean, the uniform is ill-fitting, which I know a lot of ANV troops were like that, but he's not a soldier, obviously. But it's an ill-fitting uniform, and on top of that, you can see that the Lieutenant Comer is in a position of he's seated, and it's not an equal position, so to speak. He's almost in a seated position as if he is in charge. He's in the as far as photographer is concerned, he's in the masculine position of 19th century photography. The woman usually is standing and the man is sitting. And it's also a position of authority at that period. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at that immediately, and I'm also looking at comparing both material culture wise. You can definitely see a huge difference in that way as well. But me as being a guy who worked in 19th century photography for a couple of years, that's what I saw immediately was the position of the people in the photograph.
What do you guys make of the fact that Burrell is the enslaved man? Burrell's touching Comer. What do you make of that?
Well, it certainly sort of, feeds into this, at least the idea of sort of these affectionate relationships between Victorian era men, right? Mid 19th century men, so I think it does sort of speak to, at least in this case, perhaps the paternalism, right? That Comer would, identify in terms of his relationship with Burrell, right? That they are not just comrades, but even the relationship is even more personal, right, than that, right? They share the uniform, right? They're attached at the arm, right?
That's right. I mean,
but the other thing, let me just sort of add this, Pete, real fast, is that I think the other sort of angle we can take here is sort of is to sort of question and think about how Burrell might have thought about his uniform, because of course, this may have been one of the first opportunities to wear clothing other than what he wore, back home, back on the home front. So what meaning did he attach to wearing the uniform? Did this give him a sense of self? Did this give him, that sort of revolved around sort of martial manhood, right? Might he have seen himself as a brave soldier, even though of course he wasn't a soldier? And may that, to what extent did that sort of shape his own sense of self? We do know that many of these men were outfitted by their masters as a reflection of their own social status, but we also know that these camp slaves had time on their hands in camp, and they earned money. And a number of these camp slaves used that money that they earned in camp to buy uniforms or parts of uniforms. And I found a number of accounts where, remember, these camp slaves are congregating together for periods of time. And they, in some cases, will arrange themselves in a kind of rank. They'll march from place to place and acknowledge a kind of unofficial rank within the body of camp slaves. And so it tells us something perhaps about how they were choosing to see themselves, at war, even though, of course, they're not enlisted in the army, right? They're not even acknowledged as soldiers, during the war. So it also, that this sort of material cultural analysis also, I think, gives us some insight into, how they perceived themselves at this time.
Kevin, I think those are all really interesting and provocative ideas. And I think that what you've said should be a reminder to all of us in the profession that the sources sometimes don't play nicely. Sometimes we have a piece like this photograph that provokes us to think in a creative way. And you've done so without jettisoning the sources. I mean, I think everything that you have noted speaks to the fact that these two men inhabited a world of the 19th century. I want to just one more thing about that picture, John. I'm so sorry. I just want to say something real quickly, and I don't want to make necessarily too much of it. And that is the enslaved man's arm resting upon the lieutenant. I'll just say this. I'd be surprised to see a photograph in the era of segregation in which were black and white men photographed together, but if so, that there would be this kind of physical intimacy. Now, please, I am not trying to suggest that somehow being an enslaved man was, I don't know, less threatening. That being an enslaved man gave you kind of an access or a relationship, a close relationship with a master. I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying, which I think is an important point that we're going to come back to when we talk about the monuments this afternoon. Racism is not a thing. Racism is not a thing that doesn't know time. Racism should never be trans-historical. When it becomes all those things, it becomes nothing. What racism is, and it always has been, is an ideology that continues to change. What we're seeing here and what we've talked about is racial ideology that is a part of and sanction a slave system. Can we find racist parallels throughout time? Without a doubt. But let's not water down, right, what's going on today by making long stretches to the past in which there's always been racism present, and it's always had a similar impact on how white and Black Americans have interacted. That, to me, that photograph is a telling photograph. And again, speaks to differences in ideology. I'm in no way trying to suggest, right, that enslavement was somehow less severe, less harsh than what segregation was. They are two very different, two very distinct systems of slavery. And I'll end with this. As you and everyone know, that the master class predicted that if emancipation came, if the abolitionists had their ways, that African Americans as free people would not be able to survive, that they would really just die off, not because anyone was attacking them, persecuting them, or even killing them. It was because they did not think that African Americans were capable of that. And then what happened? Emancipation came, and what did Black folks prove? They could survive just fine on their own, which then demanded what? It demanded a change in white racial ideology. It changes. It changes because of the circumstances. It changes because of the time. All right. I think I'm done with that photo. I think it's a damn good one. Very All right, John, I'll let you go for the next question.
Kevin, there's been a few questions in the comment section about camp slaves, African Americans, being utilized as soldiers according to accounts. The Frederick Douglass account came up, which I know you cover in the book, and others. And there are a few people who wish to try to understand that in a more historical context than what we may read.
Yeah. So I want to.
So no, please. I'd love you to be able to go over that, because I think
that's a great question. I'll do some show and tell. I know you guys like to do show and tell. I want to recommend this book, another UNC book. This is Glenn Brasher's book, The Peninsula Campaign and the Necessity of Emancipation. This is absolutely essential reading in terms of addressing that specific question, because what Glenn does brilliantly in this book, among other things, is he analyzes many of these newspaper accounts, including the Frederick Douglass account, but many other Northern accounts, especially during the spring and early summer of 1862 on the peninsula of Virginia, where the two armies were in close contact for a significant period of time. And it should come as no surprise that because of that fact, many Northerners, soldiers in the army, observed Black men in the Confederate earthworks performing any number of functions, right? They're present on picket duty. They're helping construct earthworks. They're even shouldering arms in some cases. I have no doubt about that in a few cases. What's important about this, I think, and this is part of Glenn's argument, is that there's a political analysis that needs to be applied, because of course what's happening in Washington is that there's a debate over about emancipation, and of course beyond that, whether or not they're going to recruit Black men into the United States Army. And so and this is especially the case, I think Glenn's right about this in terms of Douglass, that he's playing a political game here, right? He's trying to convince Lincoln that, look, the Confederacy is recruiting Black men into the army as soldiers. You better get on the ball, Abe, because if you wait too long, we're going to miss our opportunity. And so I think there's a politics here at work. The other thing that's important is that these are Northern newspaper accounts, right? Whenever I hear these stories from people, my first response is, okay, now find me the corroboration, find me the Southern newspaper accounts or any accounts from this point in time that actually acknowledge that the Confederate Army is actually enlisting soldiers, Black men, into the ranks. And you can go even beyond that, because John Beecham Jones, for example, who left us a wonderful diary, who's in Richmond at the time, he gets wind of these newspaper accounts and he writes in his diary, he says, look, we're not doing that, right? I mean, we're fighting to preserve slavery here. Why why would we possibly want to recruit black men into the Army? It makes no sense. In fact, many people who are writing at this time consider it an insult, right? It's a sort of attack on their Southern honor that they would actually do this. So I think, this is a wonderful example because a lot of these accounts live on the internet. And the problem, of course, is, in the age of social media, everyone is his or her own historian. You can set up a website. You can say whatever you want. We have access to these databases now, and we can, of course, post these newspaper accounts and say whatever we want. And the problem is a lot of people who are handling these sources just don't have the right analysis. They don't even have the right historical context. And so there are a lot of problems with the way in which these sources are handled. The Confederacy is very consistent from the beginning of the war until the very end over the policy of recruiting black men as soldiers. They go through a very long, divisive debate between 1864 and early 1865 over this very question. And after 10 plus years of research on this, I have yet to find a single account from this period in time, this debate, from anyone in the Confederacy, in the ranks, on the home front, in the Confederate Congress in Richmond, regardless of whether they're for or against enlistment, who says, by the way, we already have black men serving as soldiers in the Army. Not one. I even offered a cash reward at one point for anyone who might find an account, because I thought, wow, it would be amazing to have that. And I have yet to see it. So I think we need to be very careful about, about how we handle these sources. And I think in many ways, we should listen to what Confederates actually said during the war. Let me just say this. This was not a difficult book to research, especially, in the sense of what were Confederates saying about black soldiers during the war. They're very clear about this. I didn't have to go to an archives and beg them to open up the secret files, right? I mean, it's just not that, it wasn't that difficult. So I'll leave it at that. It's a great question.
Can you help us understand why so many people need to believe in the Black Confederate, the enslaved man who has willingly taken up arms for the same cause?
Well, I see the Black Confederate narrative as an extension of the sort of broader loyal slave narrative, right? And you can trace that back to the war itself, and even before the war, during the sort of antebellum period. But the Black Confederate narrative, in its modern form, really does date to the late 1970s, at a time when sort of our collective memory of the war is beginning to shift, coming out of the civil rights movement. Museums are beginning to sort of talk about emancipation, the place of slavery in the war. We're talking about United States colored troops at Park Service sites and other places. The books are beginning to filter out into the public, the new scholarship that's coming out. And within the Confederate heritage community, there was a pushback because, of course, this is a group that still needs to maintain that very personal connection to the past that is very much about trying to vindicate not just the Confederacy, but their own ancestors, their own Confederate ancestors. And you see in the ranks of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, by the late 1970s, you begin to sort of get wind of this sort of chatter about the steps that will need to be taken to counter this new broader narrative that's beginning to sort of make its way out there. And they start talking about the need to find examples of their own Black Confederate soldiers to counter the new focus on United States colored troops. And at first, this is very much an in-house affair. They publish a couple books from sort of vanity presses. They have Confederate Veteran magazine, and you see this throughout the 1980s. Things really begin to heat up as a result of two things: the release of the movie Glory, 1989. Right. And Ken Burns. They don't mind Glory. They absolutely hated Ken Burns, which is something I think we've lost sight of. I mean, there's a lot of reassessing Ken Burns as some kind of just trying to sort of reduce it down to a lost cause narrative. It isn't. It is much more complex than that. We've completely lost sight of the context in which that series came out. It was a shift in the scholarship, in our memory of the war. We've lost sight of that. And Burns does spend a good deal of time talking about slavery and emancipation and black soldiers. And so if you read Confederate Veteran magazine from that point in time, they are really worried about the success of that series specifically. But it's really the advent of the internet that gives this sort of new life. But Pete, getting back to the question, I think it really is part of that. When you are looking at the past through a very personal lens, you are very likely going to push away any kind of scholarship or any narrative at all that threatens that very personal identification with the past. And I think the Black Confederate narrative is a kind of rear guard attempt to hold on to the lost cause. It's still out there in 2020, but I think it's a battle that they've lost. And I think we're seeing that, of course, with the situation revolving around monuments right now.
Before we get to that, I'm just curious on your take. I think you're correct that the lost cause, and you can't really speak of it as a single perspective.
Yeah.
But certainly its interpretive force is almost non-existent, especially, let's just be honest, where it matters. In our schools, in our parks, in our colleges, it's on.
Yeah. Institutionally, yeah.
But you've raised something interesting to me, and that is why people embrace the idea of a Black Confederate. It is a way for them to defend their ancestors' service in the Confederacy as something that was not amoral, that it was not for human bondage. But above all else, and here's now where I'm getting to the question, do you think that in an unintentional way, maybe individuals like yourself, and even me to maybe a lesser extent, have pushed people into the lost cause camp because instead of seeking some kind of reconciliation, we've demonized anyone who wore the Confederate gray? I mean, I told you, I read a tweet in which someone said Robert E. Lee, to quote, was a jerk for holding slaves. Now, that, of course, is just almost an empty comment. But then I noticed that all these people either liked it or retweeted it. And it just, again, led me to want to ask you, do you have any concerns that if we want to seek real reconciliation, true understanding of the past, I'm not trying to suggest in any way that we are trying to justify or explain away the problems today. I'm talking about getting people to have a complicated understanding of the past so that we can reach an understanding of those who aren't the crazies. Because there are, Kevin, plenty of people who might hold views that we wouldn't agree with, but they're not out there with some of the real fringe elements that you've had to contend with. What are those individuals who say, my ancestor fought, I've studied this my entire life, I even know the wars about slavery, but I don't really want to be damned or my ancestors damned for getting caught up in a world that they certainly could not have controlled. So what's your response?
I hear where you're coming from. I mean, look, I think there is a distinction here that needs to be drawn between sort of the work that we do as historians, the work that we do to understand the complex relationship between master and slave at war, and just sort of the life of the Confederate soldier generally. I mean, obviously there's a wealth of scholarship that continues to be published about this particular subject. So, I mean, I think in that context, I am more than happy. Let me say it this way. I am not going to approach that conversation from a perspective of condemning anything, because my goal as a historian, as an educator, is to better understand that experience. And so that doesn't get me anywhere to start off by sort of insulting someone or to use those words that you just referenced. But when we're talking about the question of whether there's room to commemorate, or I should say celebrate, Confederate soldiers, well, then I think we're having a very different conversation. And I think there my answer is No, there is no room for that. There is very little room to. I'm not even sure what it would mean to celebrate sort of the kind of complex picture of Confederate soldiers that as scholars we embrace in a public setting, right? In the form of a monument or whatever. Monuments and statues are about whether or not we see ourselves in that particular object, whether it's a monument or something else. And I don't see that as there's not much room to work with when it comes to sort of thinking about the place of Confederate soldiers on a commemorative landscape. I don't know if that makes any sense. I think I babbled on a little bit.
John, go to the question. I'll just quickly say though, I agree with your point, except I think that you're making too hard of a line or boundary between commemoration and scholarship. Kevin, do you think anyone's going to recommend to a PhD student to do anything on Confederate history? No, come on, man. No one's doing it. I'm telling you.
Okay.
No one's doing it.
Well, that's a problem. That's a problem then with the academy, right? I mean,
But that's my point with you, Kevin, and that's what I've said before. I think what you do on the blog, you and others don't realize, is we've talked about the entire show. We on the one hand, you can't say, "Hey, public historians and academics, we're arm in arm," and then they say, "Well, no, we really aren't. That's the academy." No, I think that again, more good than bad. But here's an instance in which I think what's happening in the more popular discourse and amongst public historians has very much shaped what is seen as permissible and what we'll see. I think we'll see very few works on the Confederacy.
I guess I'm going to push back a little bit in the sense that, and again, I'm not privy to all these conversations within the academy. So look, I may not be on firm ground here, but it seems to me that the suspicion about military history as a proper topic for, say, a dissertation, that's a much broader problem that people like you and others in the field have dealt with for decades. So I guess I want to push back a little bit in terms of whether or not the work that I do, as on social media, if you want to call it work or whatever you want to call it, is to be sort of a significant factor in what you're trying to get at. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not quite there.
Okay. No. Okay. All right, John, question, or do we have other questions as we move toward Richmond? And
it's just going to get easier from here, right?
I'd like to hop on that last question very quickly about the dissertations and such. Now, mine is not going to be involved with that. I'm going to the First World War because I think that needs to be dealt with on its own course. But a friend of mine reached out to me the other day, and I had interviewed him a number of weeks ago. He's considering going on and furthering his training as a historian. And asked me, he's from Virginia. He asked me, what can I do that's different? It's a different kind of dissertation topic, different kind of thesis, whatever it may be, whatever they call it at the institution he's going to. And it just happened to be where right after everything started to come together in Richmond this past week. And I said, it'd be a really cool thing to do something on the Confederacy that I think is kind of not done a lot. And he sent me a text with question marks, because he's like, he doesn't know where I'm going with it. And I said, well, what about the, people who weren't for the Confederacy or who were victims of Confederate guerrillas who were actually living in the South and were white? How about stuff like that? Because we don't hear about that a lot. So I'm thinking that maybe because we have this plethora of things that talk about the Marble Man or talk about the Army of Northern Virginia and talk about all this, maybe there's going to be a switch to the totality of the experience in the Confederacy. I'm not sure. That's my layman terms looking from the outside in, because I'm not in academia yet. I don't know if I'll ever get there because someone has to hire me first. But I'm wondering about that as a possible way forward. Where
you mean, John, a sort of a new synthesis of the Civil War?
Yeah, like a switch.
To say battle cry. I mean, is that sort of the scale that you're sort of?
I'm wondering about dissent in the Confederacy among yeoman whites, and also those who were traumatized by when they had to give her 10% of their crop yield, things like that. And I'm thinking that there are works out there on that, but they're kind of like a side note. And I'm often wondered if that may be a direction where we could go, where we're still talking about the Confederacy and we're still talking about the issues on the home front, maybe even on the battlefront, but it might switch a little bit. I'm not sure. I wonder your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, there is, I see a good deal of scholarship coming out, if I understand what you're saying, that deals with sort of that theme. I mean, I can think of, I think good example is Stephanie McCurry's Confederate Reckoning, that deals with dissent in the Confederacy, right? I mean, Pete, you can, I think you're better positioned maybe, but I don't see a lack of scholarship.
I think, and John, I think what you're pointing to is that, yes, there's certainly scholarship that has been done in those areas, but I think also, John, what you're calling for and what I would applaud is recognition of historical actors. I don't care what time or where, but to take and to paraphrase Karl Marx's astute point that history is not always made by people, right? That history acts on people. And so that when we think about the Confederacy, to reduce it as just a racist society, and that everyone was joined by the hip because they were all racist, determined to elevate the white man. There is impressive scholarship. And for those who say, well, that's a white dude who's saying it, I'll only respond by reminding everyone that one of the most important, if not the most important, piece we've ever had on ideology and race is written by an African-American woman at Columbia. I've mentioned her name a number of times on this show, Barbara Jean Fields. It is an article that is certainly challenging race as an ideology, but throughout the piece, she reminds us time and time again that while racism is undeniable, our job, of course, is to understand its unique manifestations and to remind ourselves that particularly in the South, you'd be hard-pressed to find examples of true white solidarity. Steve N. Woodward was the one that blew that up and looking at the post-Civil War South. And I would again, in light of what has happened in the last week, to not reduce the American people to these easy, simplistic categories of white and black. It, in fact, obscures more than what it reveals. And history in this case, I think, reminds us of the need for a more complicated, a more sophisticated analytical framework. So, John, what you're saying, I think that some scholars have done what you've asked and what you've called for. I hope, again, that we'll be, and this is a word, and here's where Kevin and I go around and around just a little bit about this. My problem always with Twitter and what I've seen on some blogs is that there's a real lack of empathy. A lack of empathy for people in the past. This, rush to judgment. And it's not only of historical actors. I've been somewhat surprised about the sort of the lack of collegiality that I've seen on time to time. I say that, though, knowing that the vast majority of my colleagues who are on social media are respectful. The vast majority of my colleagues on social media get something from it. But there are young minds out there. And I really hope that they're being trained to think about the past, not just in a critical way, but in an empathetic way.
They're really, look, I think one thing you are speaking to is, this November will be 15 years that I've been blogging. So I've been at it for quite some time. And, I'll just sort of throw out there that when I started, the academic community, there were people who were very supportive, people like, Mark Grimsley, Brooke Simpson, Ken No, you, Pete. But there was a lot of suspicion out there. And it is sort of interesting to see how it has evolved over time. And I think you're right, that academics have, much more sort of fully embraced the possibilities of social media. And I think they're doing some incredible things, with it, some very high profile people. I wonder, and again, this is me, sort of, making an observation as an outsider. I wonder if as part of, programs, graduate programs, even undergraduate, I don't know, that we should be focusing a bit more on, how to effectively utilize social media. What does it mean, for the profession, right? What does it mean? How does it fit in to public outreach, things along those lines. And I think it might address some of your concerns.
Well, I think public history programs at the graduate level as well as undergraduate are doing all of those things. I think they're thinking in a very serious way about how social media and digital history in particular, how that can not just make sources and stories more accessible, but also connected to social justice. And I'm going to continue to give you pushback. You're as much an insider as anybody else, man. You've published in scholarly presses. You've gone to conferences. Now, again, you're part of it, and John as well. I mean, I know there's different gradations in terms of how involved one is, and that goes to speak about these Confederate monuments. So you now sort of, I've had a few emails, sort of look to the future now, because I'll start off with this assumption, which you can just knock down, and John, you can knock it down.
Here we go, John.
If anyone thinks, if there is a debate about whether Confederate monuments should stand or not, that debate is over. That debate is over, right? At least I think it is. I mean, there'll certainly be some spots here and there, all right? And there'll be flare-ups from time to time, but I think that debate's over. So I'd like for you and John as well to sort of talk about what's happened in this last week. Why did it happen? What does it mean? And what do you think the future looks like? How's that? We're good as historians looking at the back and the past.
Right.
Look at the future, young man. Look to the future. What do you think?
You want to start? You want me to jump in, or?
Well, okay. So I have this from a personal standpoint. So I know you have to keep personality out of it or whatever else, but this is why I'm here. This is why I'm starting to do what I do. As a young man of 12, 13 years old, I started doing historical interpretation. It happened right after the Ken Burns documentary came out, like you brought up earlier. I was heavily influenced by people who were heavily influenced by lost cause narratives. So I was lied to by this propaganda, I'll just say it right out, for 10 to 12, 15 years. And I see blowback from that by a lot of people in my generation who read the stuff in textbooks, who had it drilled into their heads in other ways, whichever way that may be. I see it from that standpoint of we're basically having a moment where we're reflecting on, we need to make this right, and we need to have our own kind of come to Jesus moment, as if I would say it that way. I'll just be harsh with it and be like that. I totally understand why things are happening. I understood why people torched the UDC headquarters. Do I believe that should have been done? I'm not going to say that, but I'm going to say that I understood why it was done, because it's been going on. That has been a spot in Richmond for years. That has been, a sense of an open wound, so to speak. As I watch this unfold, I see this narrative, this myth, slowly starting to crumble along with these statues. They're starting to come down, and we're starting to have this moment where I think that we're slowly beginning to look towards the past in a new way. And I mean that as in we're going to look to books like Kevin's, we're going to look to books like that we've had people on here, to your book, Pete, to whoever it may be. And we're going to start researching this stuff, because I'm seeing people online doing good things with history for a change. And it's starting to be a louder voice than the old way of doing things. And I'm really, there's always going to be extremes. That's just the way it is. That's life. That's human nature. But I'm starting to understand why things are happening the way they are. And I know what it's like to feel lied to for over a decade of your life. And I as a white male, I was lied to and told that I should pass this on. It wasn't until about 2008 when I'll just say it, I was volunteering for the Obama campaign. These same people who I trusted for years came up to me and said that I was a race traitor. What are you to do as a 27-year-old man? Well, you just have to walk away, and you keep that internally. There are hundreds of other people like that, and there are hundreds of thousands of our Black friends who feel even more to this cause than I could ever be as a white male. And that's why I've been silent a lot this week, because I'm listening. Now more than ever, I'm listening. And I'm seeing great historians like Emmanuel Dabney giving Reconstruction book lists. Marvin Alonzo Greer out there doing great things. I'm seeing Christy Coleman on there doing great things. And so I've been paying attention to those voices because I want to hear them. I don't think people need to hear from me anymore about that. So it's another reason why I'm going to First World War. And people don't need to hear from me on this subject much longer.
I think that's well said, John. And a lot of that I resonates with me. I think we do have to step back and acknowledge that this debate is nothing new, that these monuments have been controversial in many cases from the very day they were dedicated. I think we do have to, and I think we have to acknowledge, Pete, to sort of push back a little bit on something you said a few minutes ago regarding complexity and our obligation to acknowledge the complexity of the past. And again, as historians, I agree with that. But these monuments and memorials were not put up to reflect the complexity of the past. These monuments were put up to reflect, supposedly, the collective values of everyone in a specific community. And I think if you were to overlay a map of the Jim Crow South over, and place it over a map that has the dots basically referencing all the monuments and memorials in the South, in many of those places, on the day those monuments were dedicated, more than half of the population was African American. And so I think it's not that the problem isn't that these monuments don't reflect the values of Americans today. It's that in many cases they never did. And I think the other point I would want to stress here is that I agree with you that the debate is over. If it's a history debate you want to have, I think that fundamentally sort of misses what this is about. This is not about history. We, as historians, we're not driving this conversation. The activists do not need a history lesson. The people, yes, in many cases, because I think these are political debates. These are questions about, in many cases, deeply seated racial and economic inequities. I think the Lee Monument in Richmond is a perfect example, as I'm sort of finishing up an op-ed about this as we speak. The Lee Monument and the other monuments on Monument Avenue, in contrast to many other monuments, which were placed in public spaces after the fact, they were added to the landscape. Monument Avenue was created as part of a new neighborhood in Richmond's West End. And if you go through the Richmond Times-Dispatch and read the ads for the real estate companies that are selling lots, they're very clear in the restrictions that these lots will not be sold to African Americans. And so right from the beginning, these monuments framed the white supremacy that was taking root in cities like Richmond. I think that is undeniable. And I think what we're seeing today, especially in the last 5 years since the shootings in Charleston, I think we are having, I don't want to call it a discussion necessarily, but we are experiencing the feelings and the beliefs in many cases from a group of people who have never had the opportunity to voice those concerns in the past. These are discussions that should have had taken place 100+ years ago. And if they had, I think our commemorative landscape would have looked very different. I don't think we would have had as many Confederate monuments. I think we would have had a wider range of monuments if we were going to reflect the kind of complexity of the past that you want to get at, that all of us as historians want to get at. Yeah, these monuments and memorials don't do it today, and they never did it. So go ahead.
And again, I hope I didn't misspeak in that. Yeah. I don't think that this moment, the moment in which people need even a complex understanding of the past. But what I think this moment does reveal to me, and it's one of great hopefulness, because this expression of democracy, and yes, there has been incidents that are more than unfortunate in terms of destruction and also, of course, other people getting hurt or getting killed. But this explosion that has taken place. And it's an explosion that has been animated by the murder of a man. But with that, we're starting already now to see that there are other issues that are coming to surface. And those issues are certainly related to the experience of African Americans.
Yeah.
What I'd like to see, Kevin,
yeah.
What I'd like to see is an emergence of a more critical conscience that comes out. And I'd like to even actually be honest, hear it from you. And I'd like to hear it from you in that we need, I believe, to stop overly racializing all the forces that came together here, all the forces that have led to discrimination in housing for African Americans, that have led to the fact that they don't get equal pay, that lead to the fact that the jobs are not accessible, that lead to the fact of Black incarceration. All of those issues, Kevin, I think too many on our team actually try to look to the past, to say to a monument that this has sanctioned these inequalities that are still with us today, which you did sort of hint at. But let me again be clear about this.
Yeah.
Let me be clear about this. And what I want to do is actually read from another African American. He's an anthropologist, Silencing the Past. I've mentioned on the show before.
I just started reading it.
It's a brilliant book.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant book. And so I'm going to quote from him, which really captures, again, what I hope will come out of this from the historical community, because I do disagree with you. Activists need history. I'm not suggesting that we need to go to their meetings and that I need to get out PowerPoint, but people do need history. And this is what Trudeau says. It's brilliant. The so-called legacies of past horrors, slavery, colonialism, the Holocaust, are possible only because of the renewal of practices of power and domination. And that renewal only occurs in the present. And so and I'll ask again, both of you, is there what I'm so struck by is that in this inspiring, spontaneous, in a sense, I'll call it an uprising in the very best sense of that word, that it is very much rooted within an African American community that has suffered from deindustrialization, an African American community that's caught in the throes of globalism, an African American community like poor whites in this country that face very similar problems. Is there a racial element? Absolutely, right? When there was a crack epidemic, what did the Reagan administration say? Just say no, right? Just say no. And if you're not going to say no, we're going to lock your ass up. What do we say now with the opioid epidemic in this country? We need to get what? Counseling and therapy. Well, absolutely, we need to do all that. So I'm not trying to deny the racial element of this. I acknowledge it. But what, in fact, is behind the forces of inequality today, what is behind those who have power today, have to be rooted within deindustrialization, globalism, and there has to be an element of class that helps us understand the power of place in this moment. And we're not getting it. We don't get it on blogs very often, and we don't get it from our media.
I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying. I mean, it's not that I am trying to reduce everything to
race.
To race. It's that, that's what we're hearing from the people on the ground. Those are the messages that are being, quote unquote, tagged on the monuments on Monument Avenue in Richmond. So that language, I think, is for at least the people who are engaged in those activities, that's what's real. And so I'm not quite sure what would be involved in trying to sort of
because Kevin, what I'm trying to say, and I don't want us to go back and forth here, in terms of you're determining what's real behind their language, I think that you and I don't know in terms of what's real. What are their data?
I don't claim to know what's real. I
think though that we and they know that what's very much real. They don't have great insurance. Well, most of us don't, right? Their working conditions are terrible. Their pay's not good. And I mean, those are all the things that lead, of course, to many of their communities, right?
Yeah. I don't claim to know any. I don't claim in any way to know that lived experience. I don't claim to have any access to that, right? But what I do know is that the monuments have become sort of the targets that that have served as a surrogate, I guess, for all of those those deeply embedded, longstanding grievances. And you, I think, readily admit that the monuments are part of that story, right?
Absolutely.
And I think they do hold great significance in terms of as symbols of white power and white and sort of white privilege and white dominance in our communities across the country. So it's no surprise, when they become the target, and we'll have to deal with that. I mean,
well, it's already happened.
You asked what's going to happen in the next few weeks. Well, in the future, I think we're already getting a sense of it. I wake up every day, and my first question when I turn the computer on is, okay, which monument's been removed now, right? What happened overnight? And the crews in Richmond showed up this morning. They're getting set to remove Lee. He's coming down. The rest of them, I mean, it's impossible to sort of. I'm still having difficulty wrapping my head around it. It's happening so fast. But
what do you think about Confederate monuments on national battlefield parks?
Well, that's a totally different ballgame, because we're talking about federal property, right?
Right.
So that's a whole different conversation.
Right.
The only thing I'll say about that is I do think, and I think the National Park Service, has been thinking very carefully about this, and I applaud them for it. But I think the rest of us, it would do us well to sort of reflect on the fact that when we do visit Civil War battlefields, that we are looking at mainly people who look like us, right? And that, I think, has a lot to do with the way in which these sites have been interpreted, the sight of the Confederate battle flag on these landscapes, and any number of things, right? And so I don't know if it really helps us to debate whether these monuments should be removed. They're not going anywhere for the obvious reasons. The question is, how do we actually, what kind of experience can we give, offer people who traditionally have not visited battlefields? And I think not just African Americans, I'm actually as much concerned about how do we appeal to the wide range of immigrants that have some stake in the story, no doubt. And certainly there's a great deal of new scholarship that has framed the Civil War around an international context. But
Kevin, I have to say, again, a little pushback. I'm surprised that you think people have to have a stake in the story because somehow their family connection is part of it. So that if you're an immigrant, well, now we've talked about global history, so you can see yourself in the past. As you well know, Kevin, studies of visitor expectations and why people come and visit historical sites or cultural museums, it often doesn't come down to whether there's an exhibit in which they can see their own personal story. It actually comes down to the fact that they have had experiences in their youth in which, as families, right, that they have gone, and they have been as much as sort of recreational as historical. And Kevin, again, I just have to press, I'm shocked. Why can't we say that, yes, we need people of all backgrounds? Because I can assure you, you can go 40 miles to the west of here and you'll be in the heart of Appalachia. And there are a lot of poor white folks that have never set foot here. Why is it? But why is it when you say, hey, I want to bring different people here who don't look like me? Kevin, you're making the same mistake that everyone makes about whiteness. No, we're all different.
I'm just sort of. I appreciate that.
I'll give you a good example. I and another friend on campus, we organized a trip for the Latino community in Adams County because we have a fairly large one. And Civil War Institute sponsored it with the Center for Public Service at Gettysburg College. It was a great trip. But guess what? We couldn't get into the visitor center because the Gettysburg Foundation, not the National Park, I want to say it again, not the National Park. The Gettysburg Foundation would not allow our group to come for free, even after I made the case that, of course, they're not only locals, but they are people who are working poor.
Right. So there's an economic factor here.
That's right. You get a young person here, and I don't care what their background is, and you get them with Barb Sanders among the superb people at her staff, and you'll get them interested in history. But for the love of God, we have to start recognizing that we got poor people that don't get to these cultures.
No, look, I don't have any. I have no beef with that. I think you're making a really good point. I guess I'm also influenced by reading people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who have reflected deeply about what it's like to visit a Civil War battlefield, and what that experience is like as one of the very few African American families taking in the landscape and the interpretation. So I'm with you on that. I think all of these things are factors. I guess I was just trying to sort of get beyond the monuments there for a second, right? But I take your point. I think it's a good one.
John, do you have any other questions that are waiting for Kevin, or any that you want to throw at Kevin? Oh, we've got to do this a lot.
There are a lot of people who are discussing the need for more education on Reconstruction and the lost cause narrative to understand what we're going through today. And I know that I can honestly say that from my Black friends, I've learned more about Black history in 2 weeks than I did in 12 years of schooling. So that's something we need to take into effect too. And it's just amazing to see that. There are a lot of people in here though who are saying about that they have Confederate monuments at their courthouses, and they've tried to understand why they're there, looking up different things involved with why that monument is there and such. And I think this is causing a great series of comments just in what we've discussed here, and it's showing in a microcosm of the broader picture of what we're talking about across all spectrums right now. And it's really interesting to see it in the comment section. And I know over the next couple of days, we'll go through them and see that, because it's really something to see what people are saying about what they were taught, what they have in their hometowns. They didn't know what the lost cause was until recently, Reconstruction issues, because it seems like we jumped from the Civil War right to Jim Crow. We don't know what's going on in the center. It's really full of exactly what we need to be discussing right now, and what we need to be listening to right now as well. And that's why I've been taking it all in across multiple platforms, because I've really been watching how we interact with this point in time, because in 5-10 years, hopefully when I'm teaching American studies, we're going to be going over this pretty hardcore and saying this is the difference that, one generation or multiple generations coming together to work together can make on historical narrative. Because I think that when we hear people say, when you tear down monuments, you're taking away history. I think that if we would take that time where we argue about that and instead read, number one, 2, stop cutting arts and humanities and stop cutting funding to educational purposes, then we would actually learn our history instead of worrying about, where in our town this monument is placed. Let's think about the overall picture, because I can count on one hand how many monuments I've been around in my lifetime. And I've been to many places, battlefields, historical sites, all this stuff, where I've learned history from a monument. And I think that goes back to the reasoning of why is this monument here? Why did they put it here? And it goes back to what Kevin was saying earlier about, the time period these were put up, messaging. Why is this here? I know why. When we took a field trip to Richmond in my old reenacting unit, I knew exactly why those guys wanted to go down Monument Avenue to every Confederate thing. And I know exactly why they hated when they put up an Arthur Ashe statue. I know exactly why they did. And this goes back to experience. And I know that if it's like that for me, what's it like for someone like Christy Coleman? Or what's it like for someone like Marvin Alonzo Greer? And I think that what we need to be doing now more than ever is listening to those voices and try to understand it. I'm almost like, I've done interpretation for 25 years. I'm ready to listen now.
Yeah. I think the question to ask is, in the case of the Robert E. Lee statue that once stood in New Orleans, and I think Mitch Landrieu, when he gave his address as the monument was being dismantled, was, what do you expect an African-American mother and father to say to their daughter, their 5-year-old daughter, when she asks, why is that man the highest? Why is he looking down on me? What did he do? And what do you expect those parents to say? Does Robert E. Lee reflect what we aspire to as residents in that community? Does he reflect our collective values? If you don't like Robert E. Lee for a second, think about Nathan Bedford Forrest, right? And I think those voices, right? I mean, we know, so we can, I can't feel that pain. I've never walked by a monument and had to feel as if I'm a second-class citizen. I've never had to walk by a monument and feel as if I am unwelcome. But I do think it's important to listen to people who have always known that, right? And I think I'm grateful that we actually, it's not that we're hearing them, we're doing something about it. I think that's absolutely critical right now, because I think that it's not just it's not background noise, right? I think it is part of the problem that we're dealing with, and these are things that we have to face before I think we can deal with some of the things that Pete, you rightfully pointed out about.
But Kevin, this is about police brutality that triggered it. It wasn't about Confederate heritage that triggered it. It's about police brutality. And the stage was Confederate monuments, and which makes perfect sense, because the destruction of those monuments is about regime change. It's much bigger, like you've already.
Yeah, I agree.
It's much bigger than history. It's much bigger than someone being offended by a Confederate monument, which I'm not trying to minimize. I'm simply saying to you that we are now at the moment in which we should, right, start to look very deeply at some of these underlying issues. When people use the word race, what are they speaking of? Or in fact, are whites and blacks sometimes using the word racism as this is a cure? We can cure racism, which is of course an absurdity, because racial ideas, as Barbara Jean Fields tells us, they're always going to be with us. And so again, I just want to stress that the destruction of these monuments, it's about a political moment, an insurgency. And for those who are leading it, you know, what their main concern right now is not Confederate monuments. Their main concern is keeping this momentum going to November, because let's not kid ourselves. This is a lot about their hatred for Trump. This is a lot about all the pent-up energy from the pandemic. There are lots of forces here.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So we, again, on blogs and elsewhere, can't reduce this to racism, right? And stop the conversation there.
I actually think the social media stuff is sort of irrelevant here, right? I mean,
irrelevant or relevant?
It's not as if the activists are, that's what's driving them, right? I think in saying this that we're minimizing what's motivating the people who have taken to the streets and the people who have occupied the Lee Circle, over the last week. I mean, which is one of the things I'm fascinated by, to see the way in which Richmonders, black, white, people of color, have taken ownership of that site for the first time. I can't imagine that what's sort of driving them in any way is what they're reading on social media. I
didn't suggest that. Of course they're not. Of
Well,
course,
I mean, you keep coming back. I guess you.
But Kevin,
keep coming back to what people are writing on social media, on blogs, and I guess what I'm saying is, okay, but how much do you really want to make of that?
If you really mean it doesn't really have a big of a difference, then why do you spend so much time on it? Why do you engage other people about no? And I'll just go ahead and finish this point. Of course it matters. I mean, Kevin, I said at the beginning and I'll say it at the end. Kevin, you've had a significant impact, not just on the historiography, but you have. But then you'll pretend that you're not, and you're not part of the academy, which is nonsense. You don't believe that. And you also don't believe that these conversations, that they most certainly matter.
Well, of course I believe they matter. I just don't think they rise to the level that you think.
But I'm saying that right now, that a discourse, as we know, that social media has a strong role in creating discourse. That's very different from what I'm trying. I'm not suggesting that what we talk about, someone's going to read on a Twitter feed and say, hey, wait a minute, fellas and women, I got an important point to be made. Racial ideology changes, folks. We got to change our messaging here. We can't just use race all the time. And I'm not saying that at all. What I'm simply saying is that discourse, it matters. And that discourse, of course, it coalesces around a range of things. And social media is an important part of that. And I think it is irresponsible and a cop-out No offense to my dear friend. To say, oh, it really doesn't matter here. And then, okay, I'll write whatever the hell I want to write. The hell, it certainly does matter. And you and I talked about this on the phone. You believe in that sense of responsibility and duty to the past when you write for a scholarly press like UNC. And I'd hope to God that you feel that same sense of responsibility when you're on your blog, because it does matter. And that is the highest compliment I could give my dear friend here, Kevin, because as I said to him, you sure as hell have a lot more influence than I could ever conceive of. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
Appreciate it.
Wow. I wondered if I had to put the referee shirt on here.
Because you know what, John? I mean, you and I go back and forth, and we got together, but this is how it should be.
Yeah.
Right? Kevin and I, man, I love the guy. I love what he's done. And on some things, I think he's full of it. And I think he thinks the same thing about me. But you know what? I still respect him. And we have different opinions. I don't think he's any less for it.
We work well together.
All right. That's just a respect. It's a mutual respect. That's what disagreement means, right? That's what it means.
Steve, look, there are many people who have been who've supported me, and you've been there from the beginning. None of this happens without people working together and
all together. I mean, look what John's done for me, right?
Yep.
I mean, we met a year and a half ago at the Ugly Mug, which is a wonderful coffee shop that I can't wait till it opens again. Right? And we've had this really great. I'm going to miss him. He's going to be gone in July. I'll be lost.
I'm not going that far, Pete, and we still can do live streams.
That's right. This works actually. You don't have to be in the same location.
Yeah. No, I like this kind of social media because it's conversations. People can talk things out, right? And I think it's great. Yeah.
Yep, I agree.
And I think that this media format is going to, I think the reason why we're seeing such an uptick in what is going on today is the fact that there's documentation going on. I mean, documentation is why we know what happened to George Floyd. But what's going on with the monuments, what's going on with the movement itself is becoming more diverse because this media is diverse. And we're starting to see more people reaching out and doing it. So there are very, very positive things to come out of it. It is what you put into it. If you go seeking the negative, you're going to find the negative. If you go in seeking the positive, you'll find the positive. You just block the negative, which is what you tend to do. I tend to ban the negative people and I move on because, positive mental attitude, but you can disagree like we have at points this evening, or we've had our tense moments. It's all because we can do that in a civil way. Yeah, for far too often, we listen to respond. We don't listen to understand or hear. And I think that's the difference now, where we're starting to see a lot of people listening to hear what people are actually saying.
That's nice. I like that.
And I'm tired of people who listen to respond. I want people to listen to understand or hear, at least. Even if you can't understand, at least hear them out. And I really think that's what we're going through right now. We're going through a shift in how we listen. And more people, I think, are listening now than ever before because of we're on the streets when a pandemic is going on. And two, we have social media for free. We can get on there as long as you have a phone or a computer. And you can go on and you can read Twitter and you can read Facebook or whatever medium you like or whatever blog you like. And you can learn from that. As I've been saying, I have this past where I feel like I owe it to people to listen and to kind of repent for hanging around certain people in the past. That's just me. That's my personal belief. I'm not going to divert from that. I'm going to keep listening, and I'm going to keep acknowledging what has gone wrong. I think part of that is also the fact, and I'm just being straight with you guys and with everyone watching, I think part of that is the fact that for nearly 7 years now, I've been sober. So what it is you don't understand what you are until you look inward.
Right.
And then you can start to change things and you can start to make a positive energy out of that. And I think that's what this is in a broader context, although there are many strata of what we're talking about, whether it's the economy, politics, whatever it may be, race relations, etc. We can't fix it until we start to look inward. And I'm really thinking that's where we're at right now. And I see that a lot in some of the actions that I'm seeing. Initially, there's destructive behavior, and then there's conversation, and then there's acknowledgement. And we see this time and time again. And it's the same thing we go through personally when we have a personal issue in our life. So I think that it's just that way, but on a grander scale. Yeah. So that's why I think it's very important now to listen to hear and listen to understand, instead of listening to say, okay, I got you on this question now, and I'm gonna hit you with the right hook and see what happens. I really think that this is totally different. You're seeing people of all demographics out there doing what they believe is right, and you're seeing different countries doing it as well. Yeah. So I think this is a different kind of feel than it was when I was traveling through Ferguson a few years back. This is different, and I can totally see that now. And I'm thinking that as a historian, I want everyone to document this journey, because in 20 years, I know what the next round of historians are going to want to read about. They're going to want to understand what our personal experience is right now. And I think that our conversation tonight has lended a lot to that. And I know that the comment section is very full tonight with that. But I'm thinking that it's because, we have our own shared experiences. We don't have all the answers to this because we don't have the lived experience. So that's my 2 cents. I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, that's all right. So we have on Thursday, I think is someone from your writing group, Nina Silber from Boston.
Oh, wonderful.
She will be speaking about the Civil War and the era of the New Deal. We'll also be talking about some of Nina's early works. She has been a very productive scholar. And we'll focus a little bit on her work on Northern women at war. She's also written about Southern women, but her stuff on Northern women is what really stands out. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but we'll focus on the Civil War and memory during the era of the New Deal. Kevin, thank you, buddy. It's great seeing you, man.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll have to have round two here. And
absolutely.
Absolutely.
For Kevin and I'll be on Twitter doing the post game.
That's right. Yeah. Post show on Twitter.
Yeah, it'll be fine.
Yeah. All right, guys.
But no, thank you all for tuning in. Really appreciate you. Really appreciate you filling up the comment sections with questions and comments. We know this can be a lively conversation point, especially now with what we're going through. Thank you for not filling the comment section with hatred. Because it's a very volatile point right now, and it can be easily done. So thank you for that. And we will see you on Thursday evening. Take care, everybody.